This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook, and we're at the UIC 29 Medicinal Cannabis Symposium. We're speaking with Justin Sinclair, my good friend. Hello, Justin.
Doing very well. How are you doing, Andrew?
Good, mate. You just gave a talk on the potential use of cannabis with endometriosis. Endometriosis has recently made the news, finally, because politicians and caregivers are listening and realising that this is a massive issue in women, and it's been way undertreated. So tell us first about what you covered in your talk.
Well, look, that's a really important point. I mean, the federal government last year should be applauded for what they did in so much as that national strategy for endometriosis, so that we can increase awareness, increase funding into medical research. So that's really great. But the reality is that, you know, a lot of the talks that we've been seeing at UIC have been about cannabis for conditions that are fatal. And one thing I'm trying to change is that, I mean, just because a condition isn't fatal doesn't mean that it doesn't absolutely destroy someone's life, you know, and just because you're not going to die within 5 years, actually you're going to be having a life of having to manage chronic pain. And that's what a lot of these women that have endometriosis are stuck with. So we'd seen heard a lot of talk through the communities and the different support groups that, you know, some women were using cannabis illicitly to manage their symptoms of endometriosis. So we said, well, let's do a survey, see what a broader survey that actually looks at all of the different self-management strategies. We looked at 15 that women use to try and manage their symptoms and pelvic pain, and the statistics were pretty interesting.
One of these issues, of course, not just endometriosis, but also other like gut inflammation, things like that, these chronic inflammatory disorders, is the economic issues. So this is something that, you know, as you say, the federal government should be applauded, but how long has it taken?
Yeah.
So, you know, the wheels of politics turns ever so slowly. It's grindingly slow.
Glacial.
Yeah. So now you've made an awareness with endometriosis that we need to be more aware, get better education, better medical and surgical interventions. Now you've got that hurdle of cannabis. So there's a double hurdle.
Well, it is, but I mean, the reality is the statistics speak for themselves, I think. I mean, you're really right when you were saying about the economic impact. And I mean, endometriosis is not just a disease that affects the gynecological organs. It's a disease that affects their ability to work, their social activity, their relationships, absenteeism from work and school, so on so many different levels. And I mean, an Australian report recently found that I think it's 740,000 Australian women are estimated to be impacted by endo, and that affects or impacts us economically about over $7 billion. And that 2/3 of that is because of their loss of work and income.
Yep.
So it's a really, really important, I mean, when you start looking at it from a public health perspective, it's not just a disease that needs to be managed for the person, but it really does have...
it's for the community.
Oh yeah, it's big time. So yeah, it's, and then yes, the stigma of cannabis is only slowly breaking down. But the interesting thing I think that we found from the research is that there's a small cohort of women that are not being treated effectively with modern medical practices, and that are actually relying on illicit cannabis to manage their chronic pelvic pain and other symptoms. And I think that's fairly clear.
And indeed that ties into as well what other medications are used. And you know, there's a very common misconception out there that endometriosis is just a little bit of pain, take an anti-inflammatory, a little bit of paracetamol or some ibuprofen. It's not that. A lot of these women are dependent on heavy, strong drugs, opioids and things like that. So then you've got the potential of cannabis to work as an exit drug, not how it's tainted, stigmatised as an entry drug.
And that's the statistics that we found. I mean, the reality is that even though it was a fairly small cohort, over 56% of that cohort were able to substantially reduce their pharmaceutical medications by around, I think it's 50% or more, and then moderate and down to minor. So it's a huge, almost deprescribing trend that we're seeing. And you're absolutely right. When you start looking at this particular cohort of women, it's not just NSAIDs and, you know, heat pack and go sleep it off. Some of them are going to hospital, morphine, opiates intravenously. Even David Caldecott, who's an emergency doctor, said that he sees some women that he has to admit and give ketamine infusions. I mean, to sit there and think from a risk-benefit analysis, that we could actually look at using cannabis, which is, at least in my opinion, far safer. And women are using it anyway. Imagine the results that we might be able to get if we were using a product that was standardized and quality assured.
So what about not just mitigating the use of opioids and other medications, what about an anti-inflammatory effect in its own right?
Well, I'm sure that it is, and particularly when we have seen a lot of the talks over this weekend, that there's no doubt that many of the cannabinoids, the phytocannabinoids, have anti-inflammatory effect. Specific to endometriosis, we still need to look at that, but we know that endometriosis is a dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system. We know that the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis is firmly enmeshed within that with the endocannabinoid system as well. And that's largely, obviously, why, on one level at least, as an anti-inflammatory, maybe as in immune modulation, and then all the direct pain mediation, your antidepressant effects of CBD through the 5-HT1A, all sorts of different coming together. It's multifocal, which is why these women are using it.
So, as you said at the beginning, compassionate cannabis use started with devastating diseases, cancer, epilepsy, things like that. Now, though, we're seeing potential benefit in chronic diseases that are common in the community, that are costing the healthcare system billions of dollars, that if successful, can help our healthcare system, recover or continue. And we're seeing the issues of, potential continuance of our fantastic Medicare system in Australia. So then you've got this jump, though, from, if you like, lobbying for compassionate use to lobbying for reasonable medical options for continuance of chronic care. Does that present a hurdle when you're talking about talking to government, lobbying government?
Well, look, some of the preliminary talks that were actually around, Dr. Mike Armour, who's the lead of our survey, he basically and I did have the opportunity to speak with the Federal Health Minister's office, and they're very supportive about trying to get women access to quality assured standardized botanical product. And theoretically, when you look at pelvic pain associated with endometriosis, pain is the primary cause for SAS Category B applications, for successful applications. So endometriosis itself, for the treatment of the disease, of course, there's no evidence to support that, and so that would be very unlikely to get an approval. But I think that the government has largely suggested that, for doctors that are going to go through either through authorised prescriber or the special access scheme Category B, that they would be largely supportive of reviewing women that want to use that for pain. And so I think at least, regardless of the fact that, yes, it's only a small pilot study, this is going to be the focus for my PhD research for the next 5 years. Hopefully get that done sooner, but we'll see. But the reality is, it's like, even you're saying costs, it's not just about pain. I mean, a lot of people that have any chronic disease, although we know that women with endometriosis do have increased anxiety, increased depression, the reality is when we looked at the statistics, there was significant improvement in anxiety, significant improvement in depression. Then we started to look at like chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. We got a lot of evidence for that in the statistics, but no evidence for endometriosis, which has nausea and vomiting. And so to see significant impact on that, significant improvement in the gastrointestinal symptoms associated with endometriosis, of which 90% of women generally report, I think that's all fairly significant. And the most significant improvement of all was actually sleep. And I mean, when you're in chronic pain, it's hard to sleep. And then daily functioning, mental health, it all is just this compounding avalanche. And so trying to work out the impact of how cannabis is affecting the overall quality of life of these women is something I'm really looking forward to doing, because it's something that has been swept under the carpet too long.
Where do you think cannabis should sit? Do you think it should be a special access scheme, or do you think it should be available as a prescription from your doctor? Or indeed, I've heard it said that this should be a food. This should be a non-regulated thing, that there's always going to be dangers. Peanuts, I know somebody that's been to a hospital and had an anaphylactic reaction to salmon.
Yeah.
I see no regulations over salmon.
Yeah.
So where do you think cannabis should sit in as a medicine or a food, and if it's a medicine, in what capacity?
Look, it's an interesting question, and I understand everyone having their different opinions of it. But I think the reality is that, as a medicine, well, that would mean that you need medical supervision. And I think for a very complex disease like endometriosis, which, gynecology, GP, pain specialisation, mental health maybe, you got multiple practitioners that are going to be helping them through that. So I think that for endometriosis management, it's wise to have medical supervision, standardised botanical product with quality assurance and different levels that can be titrated for that individual person. That being said, the idea that cannabis is a food, well, that's obvious too. There's a long history of use of that. Me personally, I don't have any problem with people that want to talk about cannabis should be allowed to be grown in my backyard. The problem I have is that, well, number one, you need to know what's in it. And that it's free from mold, free of pesticides, fungicide residues, heavy metals.
So if benzene residues.
Yeah, so if that stuff can be tested for, no problem from me. That's all I care about, because that's a patient safety issue. If you've got someone that's really sick and then you introduce a contaminated product, that could be game over, and that's just not acceptable to me. So the reality, though, is that there's probably, as we've seen around the world in other jurisdictions where it is already legal, there's probably some flexibility for everything in that space. But I think when you're talking about, endometriosis is a very serious chronic condition. And yes, it's got different presentation stagings 1 through 4 and progressions of severity. But the reality is that women should have the option to choose. All patients should have the option to choose, because not all patients would be able to grow. Some would be too sick. I understand the concept that yes, it's a weed, you can put it in the ground, but there's an art to that.
But there's also the administration.
Yeah, dosage form.
Like dosage forms. I think it was Daddy Mieri was telling me that most of his patients prefer the liquid and the administration of that.
And that's really interesting, because
we're used to it.
Yeah, and in the survey that we looked at, over 50% used inhaled, so they were smoking it. Okay. A smaller percentage were vaping. So, that idea is that because of a lack of sophistication in the illicit market where they're sourcing it from for different dosage forms, or was it because it's just actually more effective because when it's smoked or vaped, it's such a quick onset of action, and to deal with breakthrough pain maybe that their NSAIDs weren't dealing with or assisting, and they need that help. I mean, I've seen women so sick they just start vomiting because of the pain, and you can't wait an hour for an oil to kick in for that. And that's why I think a lot of the women may be utilising that dosage form.
So do you think in the future, and I was speaking with Lucy Haslam earlier today, and it was making us laugh, that we think this is going to be the biggest I told you so for those people that have been resistant to change. It's going to be the biggest I told you so. Having said that, going back to pain and the usage, let's talk a little bit about pharmacology. Do you think we should be looking at, when we're talking about chronic disease management, that maybe a biphasic product that has a high peak first off, but then an elongated or a sustained release, secondary effect? Or do you think we should just be using different products for different actions?
Well, that's what they're doing overseas. I mean, if it's not broke, don't fix it is generally the way that I'd look at things. And so you can get, over in the United States and Canada, a lot of people they'll wake up in the morning, judge their pain, they'll take an oral product, maybe more predominantly high in CBD, so less psychoactive, and go about their day. And then if they do have any breakthrough pain, then they could use a vaporizer or something like that to just take a quick hit and take the edge off. And then use stronger oils, maybe higher in THC, to help them sleep at night, keep the pain low so that they can actually get through. Yeah. And I think that individualization is the future of patient-centered medicine anyway. That to me is what optimal cannabis medication would be.
It's a total reverse of the stigmatization of cannabis users, the stoners, the druggies. It's a total reversal of that. There are responsible people wanting help, not getting it from standard medications. And I think one of the big things is they want to feel empowered. I hate to be negative, but I wonder if this is part of the wall that we're seeing, that this actually takes the power back to the patient from the bastion of medicine. And what I don't understand is that doctors who come on board and use medicinal cannabis to help their patients actually have a better, more successful medical relationship. So tell me how do you broach that with people who are resistant?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things to note is, Donald Abrams says that he says cannabis has been a medicine a lot longer than it hasn't.
Right.
And it's really about reintroducing, and that's one thing that a lot of people don't talk about. It's like, cannabis, like it's this new thing. Cannabis was used just 3 or 4 generations ago in this country as a medicine. It was used in hundreds of patent medications across the United States. It's probably one of the most published herbal medicines on the planet, over 19,000 hits on PubMed. But the difference is in the education of this is that many patients are going to their doctors. Doctors have only received training about its negative impacts, its potential for dependence, addiction, gateway drug, etc. Haven't updated their training on the actual science that's been materializing over the last 50 years. Don't know anything about the endocannabinoid system, and then they have these patients with the world of the internet and free open access scientific journals are educating themselves, know more about this than their doctor. And that's a very scary position for a doctor to find themselves in. And I've seen several patients that basically say, if the doctors aren't willing to learn, then we'll go elsewhere. And so that's a problem. If the doctors aren't going to be engaged in the education, that's actually driving patients into an illicit market of an non-standardized, quality-assured product.
And then you've got a medical problem.
And that's part of the actual access pathway. So with the doctors are gatekeepers of that pathway. So if they don't engage, the patient comes in, they say no, what do? Off they go. And that to me is completely unacceptable.
So what would you like to happen? Where do you see the most likely options with the political landscape in Australia at the moment?
No, don't talk to me about politics.
We got half?
Yeah, exactly.
So where are we at politically?
Look, I think what we need at the moment is more education. Education of the doctors, education of healthcare professionals, education of the politicians. That changes everything. It changes the discussion. Education is always where things start, and the patient advocates, obviously, like UIC and many others, have been waging that war. But it has to be, high-quality education that will start to change the discussion. And once that changes, that's the tipping point. It's always been the tipping point in everywhere it's happened previously. So that's where I think we need to put the majority of our time and research and funding into, is move that forward.
So we really need some brave medical practitioners.
Well, they're starting
but they need to overcome their fear of stigmatisation.
Well, they need to overcome the fear of, sometimes cognitive dissonance. I mean, the reality is that the science is there. Critically appraise it. I mean, it's the most important thing I think you should learn at university is critical thinking, and read it yourself. Yes, it takes time. I know doctors are busy. But this is going to be the future. We're already seeing it being the future in other countries. Australia will be no different. So educate yourself, learn something. It's incredible. Everything that you've been taught to think about the plant is not entirely true. That there is huge therapeutic potential for the plant. It's been used for thousands of years as a medicine. Very, from an adverse effect point of view, more people died from look at over 100 people died from paracetamol, and I can buy that in a 7-Eleven.
Yes.
And then you're going to sit there and kick stink up about giving a patient something that is far safer from what we see in public health reports.
I think it's Gerald Quigley. Every year he goes into a supermarket purposefully to buy a toxic dose of paracetamol to see if anybody talks to him or
talks him down.
And he does that to just to prove to himself that nothing changes.
And toxicologically, what a horrible way to go.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's the reality, is that from a risk-benefit analysis, it should be a no-brainer. I've had the pleasure of speaking with, apart from some of the brilliant minds that have been here, but there's so many people doing so much work, and they're not worried. And if they're the best in their field and they're not worried, then why aren't politicians listening to them? Why aren't our chief medical officers listening to them? Public health officials listening to them? And if it's because of your own beliefs and you don't want to accept new science, then you shouldn't be in that position to make that decision, in my opinion.
Talk about successful use in Israel, where it's just like, yes, it's illegal, but these people need it, so just use it medically.
Collect the data as you go.
Yeah.
Compassionately give them a standardized, quality-assured product, medically supervised, and collect the data as you go. N-of-1 studies rampant through Israel. It's the most compassionate and easiest way to collect a large amount of data to then actually data mine and find out
post-market surveillance.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then you get the converse. Then you get the people that are gainsayers for the use of medical cannabis talking about crime, increased crime in those states that have made it legal or decriminalised it. Mm-hmm. So what's actually happening here? What's the what do they call it? Somebody said running interference with the with the data. What's the real story?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I haven't kept across a lot of the recreational data because I tend to just focus on the medicinal stuff. But there seems to be differing opinions. Obviously, I mean, one thing I've noticed also in places like California and Colorado is that a lot of the teenage smoking rates of cannabis are dropping because now mum and dad are smoking. It's not cool,
right?
So they can't be doing anything that mum and dad are doing. It's kind of funny. Obviously, there's the driving issue. That's a big one here in Australia for us because the mobile drug testing that they have, and that's something that's come out of Colorado. They believe that there's higher drug driving crashes or some report that I read, and in Australia that's something that really does worry patients because even if they're legally prescribed it, you go get pulled over at an MDT, you swab it, it only tests for presence, it doesn't test for impairment.
Right.
And then you're going to have to go through the criminal. I mean, that's completely unfounded. There's no scientific basis for that, and that person could be completely unimpaired, but then now charged, losing a license, potentially losing a job, destroying their life, criminal record. Bad drug policy, bad policy.
Very bad policy, but common policy.
Well, but how many, when they are taking the swabs, are they detecting for oxycodone? Yeah. So someone could be, off their chops on that. Is that being picked up? So I mean, it's just, I don't know. I think the policy needs a great review, but that's by people much smarter than me.
Justin Sinclair, I love talking with you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your passion with us on FX Medicine today.
Welcome.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.